So of course, we know that one is water. We need water, so that we have to still find ways to have access to clean water. So one problem is sometimes we have water and we let it go very quickly back, like Belgium. Belgium's problem is that it doesn't have a good system of storage and retention. It just lets it go. Other times we have water, but it's getting now more contaminated, either by pollution, by actually fertilizers that were helping solve the food crisis in the so-called green revolution. Or sometimes it's also now we know the sea level rise, right? The water is getting too salty, so also we have to do that. But in general, we'll talk a little bit about that after. But also in terms of just how to use the shrinking amount of fresh water we have. Right? We have a shrinking amount of fresh water. We have more salt water, more brackish water. We have to be much more clever and use it much more precisely to reduce our water consumption, whether it's how long you take a shower, using clever toilets that don't have different flush, full flush or half flush, from that kind of very basic things. But of course, one of the biggest water consumers is agriculture. So that's where the agricultural sector has been developing different kinds through history, ways to irrigate agricultural land. So the oldest one is, and we'll see some examples, but the oldest one is the surface irrigation. So we all know this, no? So it's where you have like little furrows or basins of irrigation, flood irrigate. We use the kind of, in many cases in deltas, they use the natural flood, so flux of seasonal fluxes and tidal fluxes. And it often uses dikes, right? So dikes between water and trading. So that's kind of old form, still in use. None of these four they all exist concurrently. It's not that one replaces another. So sprinkler, and that's what we'll see an image of next. So the sprinkler is really, it's an overhead irrigation. So it's usually got a central pipe, and it's high pressure, so it needs energy, right? And you have to create this pressure. So we call it also, it's called central pit irrigation in Swedish. So it's sprinkler. So you bring the water up from the ground, right? High pressure, energy. Global warming works, bringing it into the system and sprinkling it more. So by pumping up from high pressure and then sprinkling it. Then we have drip or trickle irrigation, which is again, it can be super high tech and it can also be super low tech. So you can see farmers setting it up with just like tubes along each row of carrots. And they set up a little tube and they have a little hole in each one and they know exactly how much, and they have a little literally faucet. And they know that every day they have to open the faucet for 10 minutes or whatever, because they know exactly how many drips you should get. So it's kind of a simple way to say it, but this is the most water efficient. So drip, they either call it drip irrigation or trickle irrigation. And it's really, you can say that, this plant needs 4 drops, that plant needs 5 drops, it's drip by drip, drop by drop. So it's the absolute most water efficient, and the technology with sensors and that, they become very precise in this, which is quite interesting. And especially now with AI help and this and that, so that traditionally, this plant only needs 4 drops, but because of the intense sun, it needs 6 today, and then it's been enough rain that it only needs 1 or 5. So the aid of technology in this kind of agricultural science and really developing very quickly. Thank God, because we need it to use our water better. And then, of course, we have subsurface irrigation, which is where we have a very high water table. So again, a high water table means you've got the surface of yours here, right? Usually your aquifer is down here, right? And what we call high water table is where the relationship of the aquifer is closer to the surface. So it's easier to kind of So it's, and this is usually used for greenhouses. So in countries where you see a lot of greenhouses, or even in Belgium, there's a region of greenhouses, and it's where the water table, it's not because somebody decided to put greenhouses there, no, it's because the condition of the water is so we're using it with subsurface irrigation. We still need water for these things now. We only look at the architecture and say it's a greenhouse, but how does it get its water? And they're put where there's a very high water table. And it's also used for potted plants. So often where you'll have like a nursery with potted plants, you'll be able to use that. So it's, for me, it's already interesting, and again, I point to the Palestine studio, to know, I mean, I suppose in a clever system in Palestine, you would be able to use all four of these and to accentuate different ones in different places and to have an ecosystem. So this is a, well, I think we know this image or this kind of thing. So this is the example, of course, of the splitter. So then going to the central, and that's why it's also called the central pivot. So the water is still coming from an aquifer. It's being pumped up, high pressure, coming to this, and then going to it's kind of monolateral, and then this thing is also motorized and turning to equally water the crops. But it's the water coming from above, pumped. So it's also energy intensive. So, if you remember back to this map, so I'm now going to show you two projects. So, one project, the first project I'm going to show you is actually here. And it's called the Great Green Wall. So it's a project that's been developed and is in development across literally connecting East to West Africa. Why are they doing it? They're doing it on one hand to stop desertification and also to turn this degraded, desertified area into something that is more sustainable and able to have micro food production and shade and to bring vegetation into it. And the other project I will show you is in China. So it's up here. And in China, they're calling it another Great Wall. No, it's not the Great Wall of China, which is kind of a protection system against the Mongols, but here it's also a massive Chinese scale. And of course, the Chinese one has much more investments and is much more quickly being realized than the African one. There's a different political will. It's also one country in China, easier to do than, of course, several in the African continent. But both with the purpose of trying to deal with this impeding idea that we have, again, this aridity index now. It's moving, and it's what we have is degrading, and also it's getting the kind of strip is getting bigger. So part of the first part of this project is actually to combat the growth of this, right? So if you remember again, this was I should put it very sorry. So what we see is in the very north tip of Africa, before we're in like Spain, there's an area that's not yet desertified, right? And then immediately say south of this great desert, you have an area that, according to its aridity, is not yet. But of course, the fear is that we'll have desertification to the north and south of this deep orange area. So the project, in that sense, and if you see this, is to tackle the two fronts now. Okay, so they say the middle itself is so huge, it's kind of lost cause, or at least not the most urgent because it's so severely a vast expanse in terms of the area, and also so hard to try to bring a life back. So the concentration is really going from east to west, and of course it's a really interesting area. So again, north and south of the Sahara. This area that they have is, so in this area lives 232 million people. No, so it's also, in this sense, it dwarfs what we're going to see in China now. It's a huge. So in China we've got a big problem of desertification, but very little inhabitation. There's still population, but not so much. In Africa, in this part, we have so much population. And we know that Africa is the most growing continent in the world, so the population is not decreasing, it's massively growing. African age it's a very young country in terms of its mean population age, so it's growing. And with less space, you could say. So it's kind of, so they want to reverse they want to kind of halt desertification, one, and they also want to try to reverse this kind of degradation, because it's not only the problem that it's growing, but also like if we're in this kind of light orange zone, that's in the arid index, maybe we can turn it to yellow. No? So if we have green, yellow, orange, dark orange, maybe we can still bump one. We don't want it to go further to the bad. We can maybe mitigate and come back a bit. So the idea was that it's many countries working together, trying to develop this, some more successfully than others. The idea was to have this, what you're seeing on the wall, built with massive amounts of trees by the year 2030. So that's in 5 years. They're nowhere close. So I don't know, we had a really interesting lecturer here some years ago from Nigeria, and he was part of this project. The guy was fantastic. He got this so-called environmental Nobel Prize. I'll find the exact name of it and give you the list of these people because they're super interesting. There's this Nigerian guy, fantastic guy, was talking about this and saying, like, Senegal, for instance, Senegal has been doing quite good. Well, it depends on the local politics, on the local investment, no? Because this money to make these projects is not falling from the sky. It's not coming from so much development pieces, maybe development banks, but development banks always want to return on the investment, no? So clever countries and projects are trying to tie it into more development bank projects, but then it needs very clever how building this piece of this great green wall is also helping the economy, helping this now, so it's salesmanship. So anyways, it's a very bold project. Hopefully only step by step. But there's not a lot to show you. So actually I could have shown you, and I should, maybe I try to find it for next time. There are some interesting pieces in Senegal, for instance, that I know of, but they're still fragmentary. So nobody can get, even at the national scale, say in Senegal, they can't do for all of the pieces of Senegal, no? So one group can get this, one group can get that, so they kind of couple together, piece by piece, project by project, and then, yeah, is it the most strategic part? Probably not. It's the kind of most clever guys who were able to convince, to get the money to do it, and have the more political power, and better connections, blah, blah, blah. So, but there are some pieces in Senegal that I know where they're kind of building new housing, or turning, they're kind of using capacity building for farmers to contribute to this. But in China, for instance, so that area, if I remember where I showed you in the map, that they're also they have more obviously political will because they have a system that can, well, if they decide something, they can decide something, no? So historically, China was well, also as it kind of moves through its economy, it was destroying forests, like everybody else. So it's not blaming China, but they were as kind of as bad as everybody else. They were cutting their forests for this and for that. But in the recent decades, they've become one of the countries in the world that's actually planting the most trees than anybody. As a kind of trees, well, trees of course, because it's big, but even trees per person. I think Singapore is above them, but China as a whole is one of the world's better. Again, I want to stress to you here, and this is where it becomes, I would say, a little controversial, and I'll end with that. We have two notions of when you bring trees to a place. We have reforestation, like RE, right? Reforest. So you bring back the forest where it once was. Right? It's very logical, very simple. And then we have afforestation, A-F-F-O-R, right? So putting AF. Afforestation is putting trees where they were not before, right? Yeah. So that's where it becomes tricky business, no? So some people say it doesn't matter, we just need trees anywhere. And there's other people that say absolutely not. Afforestation is stupid and ridiculous. We should only do reforestation because afforestation, it won't work ultimately. That's the claim of some scientists. Now, of course, scientists, people who are specialists in forests, they also say like we're clever enough, always we're better than nature, we're so clever. We can also trick the soil, and we can actually, we can make afforestation not seem like reforestation, but we can do it in a way that will work. So that the kind of jury's still out, because there's quite some argument. But anyways, in this part of China, the idea is a lot of this is reforestation. So they wanted to. So if you see this map, it's a little bit small. But what they've tried to do is they've tried to combine afforestation, again, putting trees where they weren't. Some people would say that's a mistake. And other places, and this project tries to do both, no? So they also tried to put trees back where they once were, so where they were chopped down. And of course, where you had trees or didn't have trees depends. If you remember back in that soil diagram, where you have the natural process of not being too hot, that this kind of organic decomposition and kind of making from nitrogen to nitrates can happen, right? So it's a little complicated, but. So I wanted to also again show you another little movie. think, as you saw in the video, that yeah, they're trying to combine, which is also this trying to stop the chopping of the trees that are happening, so on the edges. So the desert is the desert now, but to keep the desert one from expanding, one story, but also to kind of stop. Well, one way to keep it from expanding is to keep the rim, as they call it, the edge, right? To keep it, to have forest breaks, to have different kinds of development that isn't destroying what they already have. And as you saw, yeah?
Those pictures are from the Great Wall.
Say it again?
Those pictures are from the initiative of the Great Wall.
This is from the Great Green Wall. So this is what we're doing, massive tree planting. So these are, but these aren't in the, so the core of the Gobi Desert is like the core of the Sahara. Okay, not, I mean, it's sand. But this is what they call the rim, you know? So the edge around. And this is where they now are, on the one hand, trying to keep people from chopping stuff, as they said, for agriculture or for mining. And on the other hand, where it's already, they're trying to kind of reforest. So they're doing afforestation in some places, and some places it's reforestation. So it's a combination. But they're doing massive, I mean, to the degree that is looking like what they're doing in Africa, where it's a much bigger problem. Look like they're not doing anything, no? Because here they're going to do it. They're doing it, no? They say it's going to be finished in 50 years, no? Which is big. It's very fast for such a gigantic project. So these are all from there. So it's where they're turning this kind of the edge of really dust and sand into cultivatable land, and also introducing new methods of farming, etc., etc. Yeah, so as I say, the interesting thing is the same for the Sahara and for other deserts, smaller deserts around the world, right? So it's always been a desert, it's always been arid, but it's growing, and it's also getting drier because they found ways to farm it, they found ways to graze on the edges, so this thing is kind of cute. Yeah?
Yes, it's invasive plants, and how these plants are going to live there around water? I don't know.
Well, the idea is they're doing it at the edge, right? And that's where they're using the most efficient water system, drip irrigation. Right? So every tree is getting not 10 drops raw. Yeah?
I think it's also what's used how they shape the soil, which just captures a little humidity, a little bit.
Well, that's what you start to see in this one.
Yeah.
Right? So, and there's a whole story, and I think actually the guys in Palestine could look at the details of that. Of also, because trees do need soil, so there's whole systems where you can grow not only trees, but also crops in kind of really low nitrate and sandy soil by tricks of micro. So indeed, they're trying to do that. And of course, what you saw also, which I think is interesting in the video, is it's not only, and this is the case for any desert, also Sahara and as I say others, but it's, you say, okay, the Gobi Desert, Mongolia, who cares, no? But of course, the leaders in Beijing, in the coast, the rich coast, they care a lot, because when you have these sandstorms, you have, many places are having these sandstorms more and more. I know part of India is also desertified, getting bigger, and the sandstorms are also influencing even millions of more people, no? That aren't living in the immediate proximity, but kind of, so it's all becoming. So this area, this region that you're seeing on the screen, It's called Duolin, D-U-O-L-I-N. I'm probably not saying it right. Duolin. It's in Inner Mongolia region. And actually, what's quite fascinating is by now, this region of China, it was only 80, so they changed the amount of the land covered. What was desert, they more than doubled the amount of land that was not desert in this one region. So it's quite a massive, massive, massive scale. So in 2000, the statistic is in 2000, 87% of this county in the Mongolia region was desert. And it made a lot of sandstorms and highly problematic division. So would this have happened, this project, if it wasn't creating problem of Beijing? I'm not so sure, but it was creating lots of problems for Beijing. And the leaders there pronounced they would plant billions of pines, over 200,000 acres, not hectares. And in 2020, they got up to 31% as forested, so not 50. But 87% was desert of this territory, and now 31% of it is forested. So it's kind of massive, massive, massive population. Yeah, and so now they also start to, so instead of being this kind of, if you remember, actually, I'm not showing it here, but if anybody knew, or those of you, I know some of you did, took landscape urbanism, I showed you also an ancient water system called canals that were, many of them were in the Gobi Desert also, no? So they were in different parts of the world, but they were in super arid, so a lot in Persia, not modern day Iran, which invented them, but they were also very prevalent in the Gobi Desert. But now, this Gobi Desert, this edge area, is also interestingly experiencing a kind of tourism boom. No? So on this, because it's no longer this kind of inhospitable, horrible place that has been abandoned from its ancient waterworks, but it's also now, so it's getting another kind of densification, urbanization, because it's no longer this inhospitable place. So quite interesting. As I say, by 2050, the government is saying that this project will be complete. We'll have planted literally billions and billions of these trees. So for them, it's the whole belt of forest down the rim is going to be, so this is in miles, not in kilometers, but 3,000 miles long and about 900 miles wide in some places. No? So sometimes it goes from being a kind of skinny thing. I don't know how skinny it gets, and sometimes it becomes a kind of massive. No? So it's not also just a line, and as you saw in the African example too, it's not equal. It's not just it's not equal. It's very dependent on. So it's two projects to me that are interesting to understand of this kind of incredible boldness. Well, and as I say, each of them are controversial to a certain degree, but interesting. So another project I want to show you is made by it's made in the US, and it's by an office called Lateral Office. It's a Canadian woman named Lola Shepherd, and actually her husband, who's now a recent wife. They live in Toronto, so same place is fun, teaching at a different university. But here they are working on a project, it was a competition in the American Southwest, So this is in California, south of Los Angeles. And it's in the US, it's the driest, the most arid condition. It's an extreme aridity. And of course, you see a diagram what's super interesting is in the US, but in many countries. So you have a river, but then the river, so it has a natural basin, but often this natural basin, say, isn't reaching, for instance, where development wants to be. So for instance, where I lived for some years, Los Angeles, if you look at Los Angeles geographically, there's no sense for it to exist. It should not be there. There's no reason that this environment would support human habitation. You could say the same of Dubai and half of the UAE, It should not, it cannot support human habitation. Well, because they have money, because they're strong men, and this and that, they can do it. So, like, for instance, when I was living in LA, how did they get the water? They stole it from the Colorado River, right? So the Colorado River, big river in the US, that eventually has its source in Mexico. So they also tried to stop it from going, like, we're not going to give the Mexicans any of the water. No, it's now in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. They're in these water wars now. Israel and Palestine. Half of the troubles is actually water. It's a water war. Who controls the source of the water? The Israelis. So, anyways, this was a story in the kind of geopolitics, that's complicated. It's Middle East and South Asia, but in the American West. And so they made a speculative project of trying to understand how they could change infrastructure, water infrastructure, and make a project that created new public space, that created new forms of productive land. So what we're looking at is actually a sea. So it's an inland sea. It's called the Salton Sea. So in fact, it's a lake. But once upon a time, if you look back in the geological formation of the land, it was a sea. Now it's become a kind of inland lake called the Salton Sea. So it's a kind of extreme example. So it's a naturally depressed area that also, when there's floods, its water collects there, not so bad, and it helps a land around it to be super agricultural. And again, stealing all the water before it reaches Mexico. But more recently, this land has become more dry, more arid, and also more polluted. So the Salton Sea has basically no biological life. I went there with a friend from Spain, landscape architect Martin Franch. He and I were walking around, and we just see like dead fish literally on the ground. It's stings and it's biologically dead, quite horrible. And the agriculture around it, there cannot be agriculture because there's no water. So this project, after office, they said, like, what can we do with this place to make a project? So as a kind of design research, they tried to understand drawing the water system at the level of the whole country, understanding the subwater basin, so Mississippi, of course, being here, Colorado River being here. So this part of California, which has no water, so you see all these areas that have like no water, is arid, of course. And the clever ones, they steal water from another water source. So, which is what they did in California through massive engineering works. So they started kind of siphoning it off because they said, we need the West Coast, we need the port, and blah, blah, blah. So, on the one hand, you have this kind of system of massive, strong-bound, big, incredibly costly, kind of defying gravity, almost defying natural flows of water, to bring water where they want it. And then also, as I said, to kind of make a canal, what they call the All-American Canal, to also keep as much water in American territory as they could. Well, and this is done everywhere in the world. No? This is an extreme example, but I know quite well some of the kind of stuff between Bangladesh and India, and I would it's almost worse. But anyways, it's bad everywhere when this happens. So kind of another form of colonialism, if you want to say, or imperialism. And of course, what you kind of get is, on the one hand, we have this kind of incredible infrastructures that were defining nature. But now we start getting a kind of, well, as I say, a biologically dead area. And where the ecology, the water health, the pH balance, the soils, well, the soils are now completely burnt out and really become more arid index, become more arid. But it also used to be, when it was the Salton Sea, used to be a really cool hangout area for kind of hippie culture, no? So it was really this kind of, it's alternative. But even that, so even for the kind of alternative guys that they were doing, very much kind of, it's been completely degraded. But just to the east of it, we still have this important agriculture. So what these guys did, again, Lola and Mason in the office, is they said, how can we in some ways invigorate this kind of dead ecology? How can we give quality to an arid condition? By rethinking very radically programs and creating new ecologies, new productive landscapes, and new public spaces. So this is the kind of plan that we have that we'll go through in steps. But what they tried to do is they said, okay, we've got, if we understand that the lake is in black, right? So we've got this kind of horrible, at the moment, it's toxic, literally, fish can't survive. So it's going to take some time to clean, and then we can have different ways of cleaning it, high tech, low tech, through plants, do this, do that. But in the meantime, maybe we can literally take, and they use the metaphor, but then also in the data, this is how there is a competition, the notion of the petri dish, you know, in your science classes, these little shallow glass dishes, you know, where you put the drops and make a white, a clear liquid turn blue by putting in a drop of something else and put some chemical stuff. So they took this petri dish. It's the notion of petri dishes, you know, it's also used in English, it's used metaphorically. So this course is a petri dish, you know, it's a kind of place for experimentation. So they literally took the form of this petri dish and they start saying, could we, in the middle of this toxic black water, could we put some petri dish of kind of clean system? So we kind of have a kind of self-autonomous ecology, an autonomous system of kind of healthy stuff, the white bubbles, the white petri dishes in this kind of toxic black stuff. So then that's one story, right? And then they start saying, so in the water itself, we occupy in a new way. We occupy it in the sea by new productive landscapes, new public spaces, new tourism, so like, we don't just have to think it's like bad, poison, but we can actually, before it's restored and made healthy, and then they said, okay, the edge, the coast, the lake front, we can slowly try to transform this kind of super arid, degraded, unused system. We can start to turn it into a new kind of productivity, new kinds of crops, new kinds of ecologies, new kinds of economies, to kind of turn this wasteland into a new generator of stuff. So they created a whole bunch of these kinds of images. Literally, I mean, okay, they're a bit making fun, no? Of course, by literally using this. So in the Ho Chi Minh studio, we have the jokes. If you don't know what to do, make a circle. No? But in this case, they were literally using it as this kind of as a system that they then took to an extreme. No? So if you're going to do circles, then do circles. No? So they again have these kind of clean water and different systems. But the idea is that this, and you'll see in detail a bit later, but this, oh, sorry. Oh, there's not here. But this, the structure of each of these things is actually a machine to clean water. So it's not just kind of the lid of the petri dish holding something inside, but it itself is a machine that's actually cleaning the dirt, the dirty water. So then they started seeing how we can work on the notion of water harvesting. Right? So it's no longer a kind of just a hydrological sink, and it's no longer just supporting monocultural landscape, but it's, as I say, new forms of habitats, new industries. So they would harvest kelp and fish, and they would return, and they would also, salt and sea. Actually, once upon a time, it was named that because it was producing salt. So they said we can also reintroduce salt production as part of the story. So they try to work also with understanding salinity. So then they kind of make a system of these different petri dishes. So a pool just for recreation, right? So for human for swimming and for hanging around. But then one's for algae, for let's say kelp or fish. Different size water harvesting, brine production, so then the creation for getting salt. And then therapeutic pools, because there's already salt in this, that you can filter it. Then they take those very diagrammatic things and they start turning them into section, so that each one is this kind of autonomous, not a shallow contribution, but different depths for different things. So you see a very shallow one, that means more surface and not so much depth, where you then have deeper ones. And they started assigning different programs to them. They then start having this industrial production of salt. And then with this kind of, you could say, quite radical proposal in a way, they start creating new systems of economies, because this area has for the last 20, 30 years been kind of considered like, well, it's next to Mexico, it's a kind of no man's land, just kind of wasteland, really using this term as wasteland. And so they were saying like this is it should be an ecology that is somehow repaired, but also taken for what it is, which is rich in salt, since it needs to be a sea, and that we can create a whole new economy, because this area around here, understandably, is really poor, so it's a very poor area, there is need of economy. So they then start having fun and games, of how to mix these things, not just as singular elements, but how to start to put them together in groupings and clusters. So, okay, it's a wild thing with strange circles, but I think for me the development of a strong systemic story, and then developing the pieces, and then seeing how the clustering works is something that we can also directly learn from, for instance, for some of those two different. And again, how they create this kind of bizarre system to trying to make it something compelling. So I think if you remember last week when I showed you the competition for the MoMA Museum of Modern Art and the PS1 for the card, the last one was also very kind of crazy, provocative, of taking this kind of huge concrete platform and cutting it out. And so I think this one, they know it themselves, they're doing it to be provocative, But what's interesting also about this project is it starts with discussions like, oh, maybe we actually can think that solvency isn't the way it's not right now. Of course, we would never want to realize this, but they took their idea and pushed it to an extreme, which to me in itself is a nice, interesting lesson. What you'll see, so you start to see already how they imagine these things to work as the kind of edge conditions. And so where they're floating and a given structure, but at a certain moment they also work as water condition for the other side of the water. So showing how it can work in different systems, and then even get into the level. Again, knowing that this is ridiculous and they'll never build it, they take their ridiculousness seriously and develop it to. So I think also, I have to say, for the Ho Chi Minh studio, I think the comment that we had yesterday from Yuri, to kind of, now that you've got these long, very well worked out sections, well, of course we can keep working for the rest of our lives and making it better, but maybe it's to take a piece of it and go for it and really show how it's an operation, how it's a mechanism that you can imagine one mechanism for one project could be used on another one, but each of you take one thing that you can push to the extreme. And for me, this is a good example of how they show to do these kinds of things. So that's the kind of craziness of lateral office. Very interesting office. They have a nice website, by the way. There are also two people who are, wow, they can do this. They have a salary from the university, and so they can do. They're not living from working in architecture or urbanism. They're living from the very crappy university salaries, but then having fun to make extreme projects. It's a nice office to look at. The other series of projects I would like to show you that are the exact opposite. So if we say that lateral office is pushing the extreme to make a point and being radical to, shall we say, discourse and that, this stuff in this study made by these two ladies, they're really looking at very precise technological and visionary architect design thinking, but how it can really do it, you know. So not kind of being provocative for the provocative sake, but really trying to challenge how to understand things. So it's a very nice book. So it's 2015. I think I mentioned it already to the group for the Palestine group, Out of Water. Literally, like, we are out of water, you know, or getting water dry. So they try to understand again how to look. So what they do is in this book is they kind of made a very careful research where they look at different architects, engineers, landscape architects, and how they are dealing with being out of water. And trying to find ways to go forward. So this first one, so this book is kind of almost a catalog of projects, you know, going from very, very, well, which was when I show you is the scale of a building, but going also to to a territorial scale. So this book is just taking a whole series of kind of cases, real cases and patterns and this kind of stuff to show strategies. So this one is looking at how to deal with the building facade, to utilize elements in the atmosphere to collect and to recycle water. So what they have is something called a solar enclosure for water reuse. And what they do is they try to develop this facade that on the one hand is dealing with so they take dirty gray water, right? So from sinks, from washing machines, from dishwasher, from the sink, not toilet water, which is considered water. But they bring it to the facade, through pipes, and through using the ultraviolet exposure that you get from intensive sun, that you can reset, you can clean the water. Right? So you can often clean water by putting oxygen in it, but also by having a lot of UV light, you can clean water. Not to drink it, but not to keep using it and to maybe use it for agriculture. So if we have less water, and there was the comment yesterday again for Palestine, like maybe change your color palette, that it's more beige and not so blue. Or if you have blue, how are you getting blue? You can also get a lot of it from the buildings human, not just from river and people. We're going to have more rainfall in the sky, but we're going to have more people and we're going to have more water moved from our buildings. So this whole thing is about kind of using a kind of closed loop, a cyclic loop system of how to clean gray water. So building by building, no? So this is each building and each building. So your building facade is cleaning your water. So it's not systemic in that sense, but it's building by building. So it's for the whole of a facade. Another interesting thing they talk about, which is also interesting in countries where we have water stress, water scarcity. And here they, of course, are using the example of the Mediterranean Sea. So, Mediterranean climate is also, it's not super arid, but it's in many cases arid and becoming more arid now. So a lot of Spain, Portugal, they're in fear of, well, also almost a kind of effect of the Sahara coming. That's one problem. Another problem is they have, so they have less precipitation, less water, more people needing less water, more people needing more water with less water available. But then they also have the sea. Now, you can't drink the seawater. So can we turn salt water to fresh water? This is the big hope, is that we have a lot of water, we have gigantic oceans, so we shouldn't, in theory, have water stress if we can figure out the technology. So what they started talking about, and they looked at here, is desalination. So how do we take the salt out of water? And it's not so easy, and it's not so cheap. So anyways, they talk about it. Of course, the biggest, the most well-known people for this are the Israelis, in fact. And the Israelis put it in the rich countries in general. So Israel is very rich, and they can pay a lot. California is also now starting to try to do this, but there's a lot of environmental resistance. There's a lot of resistance. So you could say, oh, why would people resist? You kind of have a technology, you clean the salt. But what happens is there's a side effect, or the kind of byproduct. So if we know that the byproduct of these crazy Germans was fertilizer, byproduct of this brilliant idea of changing salt water to fresh water is this kind of incredible amount of sludge, and it's toxic. No? So you get all the salt and all the crap out, you have fresh water, but then you're left with all the crap that you got out, which is toxic, and what to do with that. So that's why a lot of environmentalists and protests in California, they propose a lot, and they've almost all been shot down, because not because they don't want the fresh water, but because of the side effect. In Israel, they anyway do it. So here it's showing you where there's, well, in south of Spain, like where we have different systems. And there's two different systems. And of course, the blue ones are kind of less effective. They cost less, but they're much less effective. And the more expensive ones that I will show you are what we call reverse osmosis. So where you change the natural process of the weights of things, you know, and work with gravity, you try to kind of, so heavier water, which has salt in it, it sinks, and pressure water is lighter, no? And then you try to reverse it by massive amounts. So one bad thing is it produces a lot of undesirable byproduct, and it needs massive amounts of energy. So it's also like these pivot irrigation, yeah? It needs high pressure to pump up the water, and then once you have the water, it's easy, then it's cost of getting it up in this pipe. The cost of reverse osmosis is enormous because you need a lot of energy to kind of force, and you'll see this in the diagram of it. So it's still a little bit controversial. This is, so Israel already started, and they were the first they started desalinization already in the 1950s. So they knew they had this water crisis. They know they don't have water. That's why they're taking all the water from the Palestinians. But before they were so aggressive in taking all the water of the Palestinians, of course, you can see the history far too simple, so it's a bit facetious the way it's saying it. But they also were trying to deal with creating huge facilities. So this is an Israeli facility of desal. So where they take in the salt water and they bring it into this processing. And basically, what happens is the weight of water. So if you have a filter, right, just a simple filter, okay, they're very high tech, but you just think we've got kind of fresh water and we've got hot water. If you can push the salt water through the filter, right, you can keep the salt on the filter and you really have fresh water, right? But of course, because of the weight of things, the weight of water, when they have more salt, it's more heavy. So what they try to do is they call it reverse. So they have to push because usually the water, fresh water becomes more salty. No? It's a normal process. So fresh water, it's lighter, it flows into the heavier water. So the first run. So usually we have fresh water, and it will become more salt. Right? So what they try to do is they say we take the salt water and we have to push it through the filter. We won't do it naturally because the weight of it. We push it through. But this kind of diagram of pushing what we have to do, this is what costs tons of money because you need a lot of energy, to produce energy, you're again solving one problem, but you're having to produce energy with fossil fuels, no? So, but then they try to do these things, so they bring in the raw water, the salt water, right? They kind of take out some stuff, and then they do this huge process that takes massive amounts of energy and money, and then they still refine it, and then they actually, the idea is that this is drinking water, you know? So they take this to the level of not just being for irrigation, but for drinking water. So this is once a super, super high-tech way, and very expensive way. But it's, you have to understand, it's a very common way. So one issue for urban design, I think, eventually is to understand how do we, if we're going to do this story, right? It's kind of super expensive. We shouldn't do, but anyways, it's being done. If you're called in as urban designer to work on this, how do we start to take this massive infrastructure, also of this type, so the intake of the water, how do we design this to become something that's not just water, in this case not water cleaning machine, but a kind of water desalinization machine and turn it into public service? Yeah?
I just have a question just in terms of the process. I don't know if you know. What do they do with the extra salted water then? Would that get dumped back into the ocean?
Well, that's the thing, is it's usually not the water, but it's this sludge.
Yeah.
So it becomes like this brine and this sludge. So that's initially, if you remember, in the Salton Sea, there would be brine ponds where you can also then take all this junk. Because what you're taking out, is this stuff, right? So you're not taking out the water. There's not extra water. You're just left with the kind of brine. So some of it, you could say, you could turn to salt. But the other stuff, and that's the whole problem, is they dump it. And they dump all the, so it's highly concentrated, well, there's an word, but gunk, this kind of crappy stuff that they take in massive concentrations. And that's why there's so much environmental protest, right? Because they then have to dispose it, it's toxic, because it's also an incredibly low concentration. When it was diluted in water, it's not this high concentration, how to kind of re-dilute it back into the ocean. No, they don't care in the end, they don't care about that, they just care about getting clean water, so they dump this stuff, And this is partially why it's so controversial. And until we find a better way to think of how to do this transformation, I haven't found the diagrams of it, but I know, for instance, in Australia now, they're also trying to use salt water for an island. They're surrounded by some salt water. Trying to use salt water, cleaning it, and then, but not all the way, so not to drink, but to pump back into their depleted aquifers. So they're trying to reverse depletion of the aquifers by pushing water back in. So it's also another approach. So anyways, they look at that in the book, but then for me, so this is, again, they go through different from super high tech to more low tech, to very low tech, across scales. And this is one I find really interesting. It's called a water condenser, and it's in Yemen. It's designed for Yemen, so it's a prototype. So it's about vapor condensation. So in an arid climate, I'm sure everybody in your life has been in an arid climate, right? So in the day you're like hot as can be, you're in a t-shirt, and at night you need a sweater, because the temperature differential in the arid climates is extreme. So what they try to do in this story is that, so here the daytime temperature is about between 5 and 15 degrees Celsius hotter than the below ground temperature. So not the air temperature. So again, knowing that the Earth is an insulator, right? So they try to use that the average daytime temperature of the air, and then the below surface. There's a 5 to 15 degree temperature differential. So they make a whole design based on heat transfer, which is now the heat pumps and heat transfer. So it's a thing that's kind of more kind of simple idea in the end. So that because we have a difference of above ground and below ground, say 50 degrees, it makes a dew point, which means we get condensation. Right? So what they do is they try to make a system that deals, which is very clever. So here they show it as a kind of mechanism. And then here they start to show how it can be used in the creation of public space. So what they're so they, if we go to beyond the mechanism itself, that's using this differentiator. So the differential of the temperature creates dew, creates condensation, creates kind of small liquid with dew, vapor, which is, and then as a part cooling. So what they try to do, what we see at the scale of the city, but then at the the other urban place in the section, is that they say we can make kind of thicken the ground, you know? So if we've got the differential temperature between the air and the ground, we can use this space and we can create a cistern where we can begin to collect this water that is created by the temperature differential, by the heat exchange. And then we can have these systems. So we can also have this system between the two coming, and that's where they have a whole system of these kind of funny looking things, but where they create these kind of micro, so it's kind of outdoor air conditioning, where then you have to work out the spacing and plans in between these, but where you create little micro systems of having little drops of dew put into the air, and that creates a system, and that those become places of kind of public gathering. So there's a, this was say it's developed as a thing you can buy, no? As a mechanism, and then it gets used in urban design. And this was already in 2000, so it's like 15 years ago, it was 2009 that this was already developed. And it's so for me it's also super interesting to understand that it's a kind of technological gizmo, but it's actually, but it's not very high tech. It's based on kind of simple principle of heat exchange, and then how it can be used within a building. And I think more and more there's interesting architects and urbanists and landscape architects actually that are trying to use the kind of say meteorological and kind of special things like this, where we have extreme differences, to kind of turn those natural phenomena. So we also know, for instance, in many parts of Latin America, I think more in Peru than anywhere else, as far as I know, where they use these fog nets, no? So where we have, in Chile, where we have also deserts, so you don't have much water, but when you have this temperature differential, you can create these kind of nets, and they collect the water in this temperature differential. They collect it on a net in the desert, and then they have little bags on here to collect the water, and then to take the water we need. So I know there's entire projects made in Peru and in Chile, and then enlarged it deserts in Chile where they're using this kind of, again, this notion, not in an urban setting, more in the landscape, but it's using these kinds of principles, so I think it's super cool. So in this forest urbanism book that Bruno and I made, there was a project in there by a former colleague of mine for a competition in Peru, where the whole system developed around this notion of using this kind of dew points, and trying to work with this very small, but many things very small, significant, So I think also for Palestine, it's something that should try to understand. For me, is something more low tech, more common sense. I don't say you don't understand why it's not common. This is an example of super low cost, super low tech, super low maintenance system for rainwater harvesting that actually can be installed at the level of a household. And many households do it without designers, where you create. So in Mexico, they say 36% of the population suffers from inadequate water supply, with not everybody being linked to municipal systems. So the idea is that this system could be suitable for 50% of a household's entire water use. So the idea is that you have different ways of cisterns. It's really simple, it's not very sophisticated, it's a lot of times plastic pipes and rain barrels and mesh filters. So we learn how to catch literally on your site system. But then of course where it becomes interesting for urban design, and it's really hard to see this diagram here, I think that like how at the scale of each man for himself, you know? Everybody takes care of themselves, goes with their own household, and you take care of as much free water as you can. But then if we also start to replicate it and to think of more, so you see, so as a more public system as well, so that you can take the technology that's the system and scale it up. So how it can be is kind of super simple. But I think a lot of these things that we see are kind of solving droughts and water supply, this kind of ingenuity by necessity, you know, and kind of architecture without architects. I think what's really interesting for us is to learn how we can use it and design it, and upscale it to a sense where it works at urban design scale. So again, a simple system. And then it starts to show here of how, in principle, this could be done. So if you have a very simple system with a few simple elements, and then how you can build it up and upscale it to work for different conditions and at the scale of, say, a neighborhood or a cluster of houses, and then beyond the cluster to. So I think it's not a bad system. Also, here is actually. There's a very interesting institute, again, Palestine might be interesting. It's called the International Crops Research Institute, and also the Semi-Arid Research Institute, where they try to look at water supply and water production, and trying to shift from rain-fed. So again, we just rely on the rain account, and if it's a good year, we're very happy. If it's a bad year, we're not so happy. But this unpredictability, which we know is getting more unpredictable, the idea is that the most efficient way is to go to drip irrigation. So even there's a lot of look at how we can do drip irrigation, not with AI and all this super expensive, but super simply. And so here you see also where farmers, they put water in tanks, and then those are connected to literally a faucet. And then that has a system that in this case is also irrigating raised beds. So to me it's really interesting that they start to understand this kind of small scale. This is in South Sahara, in Africa. But of course, here, this is in North Africa, in Morocco, where traditionally we also had this notion of, and so this is very, very arid landscape. It's called Dra Valley. It's in the south part of Morocco. And traditionally, what they would do is they would separate really strongly, so they wouldn't mix. They would have the city having they wouldn't use water unnecessarily in the urban area. They would have the urban area, of course, having household use, but they would create this kind of very, very concentrated city islands almost, with urban centers, super dense, and made in particular for dealing with natural insulation, it's very dense, very small islands, to deal with the heat. And then the idea was to have this oasis, no? So the notion of the oasis in the arid landscape. And this is where they would then use, traditionally, also they would find ways to kind of create very distinct areas of, this is urban, it's not productive, and this is productive, and it's the oasis. So starting to look in this area. Here is other, again, it's all from the same book. This is a little bit complicated diagram, but again, for the Palestinian guys, I encourage you to try to read it because it looks complicated, but when you start reading everything, it's quite clever, because we know that, again, most water is used for agriculture. We need it for many other things. Yeah, and now with more and more high-tech industry, the problem is we need a lot of water for that too, for the creation of chips and but traditionally, and before the latest battery IT wave, most water, so you see the non-agricultural use, but most water is being used for agriculture. And so the idea is how can we be more clever? Also, I would even say in urban design to create cyclic systems, no? So how can we start to use this thing for many purposes, to clean it along the way, to reuse it, so not just it's not just the way we used to always think. We do everything as a kind of one-way flow, a linear system, it's good at the pipe, we take it in, we take it out. No, how can we turn everything back into more cyclic system? So it's a really great diagram, and I encourage you to try to understand it, because it's creating, how can we create as many feedback loops as possible and avoid any linear systems. Some linear systems are maybe inevitable, but the idea is here to find as many cyclic and feedback loops as we can. And then, of course, if we start to understand how we still change things, if we become more cyclic on the one hand, and if we become more less wasteful with the water we have, so if we shift our system, that we could, if we understand, okay, this is in the Jordan River Basin. Actually, this was made for the exactly where we're working. So we understand that right now we've got a very polarized system of urban and agriculture. Right? And the fight, and the guys who always win the water war is agriculture, right? They have bigger money, they have bigger lobbies, they have bigger costs. So the idea is if we can go from this kind of system in the Jordan Valley by being much more cyclic, by inversing, we can actually start to come much more to changing where the water for agriculture is not so much used for agriculture, but we give it much more. We can in the end give much more back to the river system itself, so we can restore an ecological system. So the 10% versus the 1%, but also that we can kind of fit the priority. So this was, and again, they developed a lot of cases of how to do this, and a particular focus is actually so it's about kind of decoupling things that have been coupled and trying to understand how to change this. So again, here is a design project for the Jordan River Valley, where they show how we can begin to do some of these things. So again, I put this in because I think it's really interesting for the Palestinian studio. Have you seen this book? You got your hand on this book? You know this book? But I think, look at it. Fadi gave you a lecture about this book. This is the work of Fadi for the Jordan River Valley. So, he gave you a lecture in the space of the course. Yeah, so it's a project he did when he was a student, but I think it's also it's a nice example. And these two ladies, in Ziva, they also put it in the book. Of course, this is again projects similar context. This is in Saudi Arabia. This is similar different. Again, in the same book of the water. And it's made by a very interesting group for water management called Borough Hopman. You can see the name up there. So it's a very interesting office that does a lot of kind of, you could say, super technical understandings of water systems, but always with the design spin on it. So it's really, really inspirational. So for the physics and design research components, it's an interesting office to look at. So also here it's where it's trying to understand different water formations that you see on the left, and how they relate to subsurface and aquifers. And what they try to do here is they try to understand, well, also the terms that you guys were using yesterday, of course, knowing that this kind of what we call creeks or streams, or wadis. So understanding how we can understand this kind of wadi restoration, as you see. So for them to understand how the wadis work, it's very important to understand the groundwater system as well, because they're. So this was a project developed again by this office and realized. So just to take you a little bit through this, so they took one area of this wadi and they started to bring in small systems, and you see it in section. So little teeny, similar to what they need to do in the desert area, right? To make small, like kind of little, almost like seas in the landscape that collect little water, and then comes to go, or kind of little bowls in an otherwise flat landscape, and then building mounds. So here they looked at a piece of a wadi and turning it, trying to restore it by creating more these moon shapes, to collect small pieces of water, to agglomerate them together, and you can start to create a system. And they developed it as a kind of way to be wet, basically part in Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, in doing that, to turn it into a public space. So it's not enough. Well, we're not water engineers, so they're good as water engineering, but the water engineering is also a public space, so it's also a design. So for me, it's part of fascinating in that sense of understanding how they also, and what's really quite interesting, of course, knowing the cultural context in Saudi Arabia, is that they also create particular spaces only for women, others only not. So they design it to kind of accommodate the cultural kind of appropriation of public space, but it's not the same for everybody. It's more intimate, even smaller spaces. They really like to congregate without men. Very stay in the water or something, and others also. It's a kind of it's trying to understand the cultural context to create the different spaces. So then maybe I show you this in a minute, because so I would like to show you this is in two projects, so two very different projects. So this Peruvian frog catchers, but also this kind of ice stupas. So I will go back to that in a minute. But I just show you this. So this is a really, really wonderful woman. Her name is Roberta Elton. She's now the head of the school in Europe, which just she made her PhD actually in water, and she was working for a long time with Christophe Giraud, the course of architecture in Zurich, and she's a really, really wonderful writer. There's a book of hers called Plant Life, and actually it's really quite fascinating. So she in this moment in time, particularly I would say about politicians, there's a big trees. Trees are good everywhere, here, there, and there. Just put trees. And she said, yeah, not so quick, not so easy. So she takes three. She said, we can't just think about trees, but we have to think about the life of a plant. And like where a plant wants to be and where a plant doesn't want to be. A plant doesn't want to be everywhere. So she looks at three projects in kind of critically reference time. One is the Chinese project that I showed you. One is the American, it's called the shutter belt. So kind of dust bowl on these American, like Oklahoma, and so it's there's a huge dust storm, repeated dust storms destroying crops. So the American government decided to go from sort of the kind of American Midwest or more west, the west of the Midwest. They built a kind of like the Great Green Wall of Africa or the Great Green Wall of China. Instead of going east-west, they built north-south. That was a disaster. It didn't work at all. So she's the third project. Anyways, three big projects. But she very, very cleverly goes through these projects. But of course, gives the bigger story and kind of wondering with all of this science we know now about trees and forests. She says we have to be careful to not just kind of fall into the trap of an Excel sheet and kind of saying that we did 1 million trees and that, which trees where and why and how. So it's a very, very well. I won't show you that we need to do this, but what I will show you is these other two. So first one is very nice video from Al Jazeera that has very good video. And good documentaries. So it's about this in a place where we also have not so much water. How to get water by harnessing cheaply a natural process in a very clever way. And for me, what's so interesting about this is I had seen this quite some time ago and heard about it. So there's many companies you can watch about it. But actually, I was in a review in Hong Kong with the landscape gang, different teachers, but people that those in Ho Chi Minh met. And they had a whole project, well, one thesis project, that was one project. It's one thesis project that tried to use this technology as a way to structure, to design a landscape, and it was really clever. So anyways,
Dit slimme apparaat maakt automatisch een backup van je foto's en video's telkens wanneer je je telefoon oplaadt. Het kan tot wel 500.000 foto's opslaan en organiseren, waardoor je nooit meer hoeft te betalen voor een abonnement op cloudopslag. Dankzij de zachte stroommodulatie is het daarnaast 300%
Millions of people rely directly on glacial meltwater for survival. Due to climate change, these reservoirs in the sky are disappearing at an alarming rate. Some scientists have predicted that by the end of the century, much of the Himalayas could be practically ice-free. Here in Ladakh, which experiences only 50 millimeters of annual rainfall, glaciers have been the life source for centuries. But due to climate change, over 14% of the local glaciated area has been lost in the last 50 years. I'm here to visit an engineer who's come up with a beautiful and extraordinary way of preserving the glacial water using monuments made of ice. In the town of Leh, I meet Sewan Dome, a local environmental scientist.
I understand that you are a bit an expert about climate change and the effects on mountain communities.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us a sense of some of the challenges that they're facing here in Leh?
The main crisis is that you have a carbon pressure.
Is that what we can see?
That's carbon pressure, and that's where 80% of the water is coming for the Leh residents, and that pressure is receding at a very fast rate. And every family in Leh has a guest house, and they drain groundwater like anything. If there is no glacial water to recharge the groundwater, and of course there will be water crisis, you will see people fighting over water.
Literally.
Yeah, literally. The situation is getting worse by the day.
Almost 1 billion people are affected by shrinking glaciers throughout the Himalayas. In nearby village Phiang, farmers are on the front line. Sonam Dolma and Phunchuk Anchuk have been working here for more than 40 years.
Thank you. Oh, Sonam, thank you so much. Thank you, Jimmy. Okay, so cheers. Have you noticed any changes, perhaps with the seasons or with the levels of water?
noi nisci ये लोग निशी का कला ये कला शेयर सोचिए तो पाकिस्तान से खामता तुझी चल इन्ना सपा यों खामता बिजना कमी में तान से तो तुझी चलना नक्शे का की रिवी फ्रांस अस्कुलना काफी से चीज़ मार्शल जिसका वैसे चीज़ ने कमी में पयाम चीज़ में मना क्यों भी ऐसे काफी से तो चीज़ सेंटर काफी
Here in the region of Ladakh, the population relies heavily on the Indus River. But with the situation getting dramatically worse, a local engineer, Sonam Wanchuk, has stepped up to the challenge of helping the villagers adapt to these changes.
In January, February, nobody needs water, so the streams flow and go into the Indus and into the ocean. Whereas in April, May, everybody, all plants, all humans are all dying for water. And then there's acute shortage of water. What ice scuba does is by using winter water, storing it in the form of ice, and it melts exactly when there's this acute shortage. That spring problem is solved using winter water into ice that melts in spring, and then you're set.
At the Environmental Mountain School he founded in 1988, Sonam has been refining and teaching his ice stupa concept for the last 2 years.
The pipe brings water, and then it falls down and becomes a stupa, right? Next 40, 50 years, the people who will be running this world are now in schools and colleges. I want to engage them in these innovative ways to be sensitive towards the environment in the mountains, so that then the earth could be in safe hands. And before we go to the ice stupa, we'll see a little demonstration of how it is formed up. Now that, suppose, is the mountain, and that bucket there is, say, the stream. From the lake or the stream, water comes in the pipe, which is underground, but here you can see, and there is pressure in the pipe. And then it comes like this. So you can see small droplets, which means water is exposed to the -20, -30 air, loses its heat, and freezes. There is no moving part, there is no electricity, just gravity. That's the beauty of it. Good.
We're heading up to the ice stupas further up in the mountains, but first we have to make a quick stop.
Oh god, okay, what have we got into here? They use these for ice stupas to get us from. So this is a kind of vital part, it's like the skeleton of this stupa, if you like. I'll go and give them a hand, right?
Now, imagine no longer needing to spend hours analyzing charts, keeping up with economic news, or mapping the whole.
This is, now I understand. You know? It's quite it's a bonkers idea. It's quite crazy, really.
The design of the stupa is critical for its success. It must have a minimal surface area to provide a maximum protection from the sun. This enables it to last long into spring, sometimes up to 4 months. If the same volume of ice was a flat glacier, it would melt within days.
This kid's climbing the top with his crampons and ice axe, and he's thrown down this rope and he's just pulling them up piece by piece and just adding them to the pile.
The prickly buckthorn is added all the way to the top of the stupa. The water catches onto the thorns, making it easier to crystallize in the cold weather.
And when you see the size of it, you really understand how that could have a significant impact for irrigation. What do you reckon the volume of water is there?
2 million liters. 2 million liters, yes.
At the bottom of that tunnel, really in the heart of the ice stupa, is this large pipe. And that's the one that's channeling the meltwater down from the glacier up on the mountain. It's coming down to the base of that pipe, and because of that head of pressure, it's forcing it 15 or 20 meters up into the air, which out into a sprinkler to coat the outer structure. It's quite spooky in there.
Sonam's vision isn't just about a handful of ice stupas in one mountain village, but hundreds of them, protecting the entire Himalayas and helping irrigate fields and forests. 5,000 trees were planted in 2015 and are irrigated each spring with the water harvested from the ice stupas. He's already won global recognition for this project.
What's the future for these guys? Where do you see this going in the next few years?
I see it going in 2 different directions. Lower and lower towards the people in the villages, higher and higher towards the highest parts of the valley, where you can grow many of them, chains of them. So our hope is we could reglitiate what we have lost to buy time and adapt to changing climate.
So we've just lost the sun over the hill there. It's getting cold very quickly, but we've got a plan. We've got Stanton and Thomas here, and they've brought some prayer flags to tie up onto the top of these 2 ice stupas, and we'll get a sense tomorrow morning how effective they are at creating these amazing structures.
The water in the pipe is released overnight when temperatures reach -20 or -30 degrees. Slowly building up these structures until they reach heights of 60 or 70 feet.
Yeah! It's like oiling. It's like you struck oil, but you struck water, eh?
The next morning, I returned to the stupas to see the changes that have happened overnight.
Wow. Oh man, look at that. That is fantastic, isn't it? I want to climb up it, but I don't know if that's a good idea. Let's see. If I get stuck, I'm going to make quite a nice addition to this sculpture. I'm just thinking, they're going to come back tomorrow and frame it into. Bearing in mind, the whole reason that they're doing this is to try and conserve that winter meltwater. It's like a kind of water battery. They charge it up in the winter, and then it melts in the spring.
We are losing our glaciers almost for no fault of ours. Life would not have been possible at all in this desert had it not been for those glaciers. Because it had this fossilized water from tens of thousands of years ago, we are able to survive. And if they are gone, we'll be gone. And it will be a real desert with no life. People in big cities, if they live simply, then people in the mountains would simply live. Yeah? And sooner or later, it will come to their own doorsteps. So we should be sensitive to see the first signs and mend our ways.
Okay, and then the other one's much shorter, so.
Eran ciegos, tenían el agua a la mano. Estamos cambiando la vida de unos 6.500 personas al mundo. Tiene la función de capturar las microgotas que están suspendidas en el aire. En esta malla chocan y ahí empiezan a discurrir en la parte baja. Por todas estas canaletas, por toda la tubería va a este tanque que está ahí en la parte baja. De 200 litros hasta 400 litros de agua al día, un panel de estos capturan.
Utilizo para regar mis plantas que tienen la parte baja que están ahí. Yo mismo lo siembro y yo mismo lo cosecho y yo mismo lo consumo. A mí me cambia mucho la vida, ¿no? Estamos robándole un poquito del cielo que nos está brindando el líquido vital.
¿Lo vas a usar para qué es ahora?
Para cocinar. Hoy día voy a hacer una rica sopa.
Estamos creando realmente una agricultura urbana para la gente humilde, para que puedan vivir. Ellos están haciendo un ahorro. En esta parte está todo verde, gracias a que la señora Teresa está sembrando y cosechando, pero esta parte es seca, ¿ve? ¿Cómo puede cambiar solamente el agua? Es caótico vivir sin agua. Esto ya nos ayuda en algo.
First of all, the whole question of space. Space is very expensive in urban areas. Second thing is that investors are always investing because they want a return on their money. Presumably, this technology has application for poor people, right? Poor people don't have money by definition. So an investor putting in money to help poor people and not able to realize money, they're not going to do it.
Even if it's not something that lasts forever, water is so important for local communities that I think that there would be some potential to doing this elsewhere.
Emocionado porque podíamos tener una entrada de un líquido más para poder regar nuestras plantas, ¿no? Y de ahí entonces empezamos a sembrar ya nuestros propios alimentos, ¿no?
Eso lo hace todo arriba.
Sí,
Creo que estoy contribuyendo de una manera más eficaz a que muchas familias estén cambiando su vida, su forma de pensar, su forma de ver el problema. Para mí eso es suficiente, más que orgulloso de hacer estas cosas por los demás.
Okay. So, so we'll take a few minutes break, and then I'll figure out how we can look at our things. Maybe what we can do for looking at your work is that you could just show your final one. You've uploaded all the prompts, and so I will of course look carefully to all that. But maybe we can just get a kind of quick view to see. I'm also curious of the final prompt and the final image. So we can try to quickly. Maybe we see how far we get, and then we can try to finish it also next week. Too much overtime. Okay, so let's just take a shortish break, and then we look at it. At least we start with a few.